Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavaditamastu Ma Vivishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us. May he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Peace, peace, peace. And good evening. We're continuing our discussion of Durga. Last time we read some selections from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna and saw how he emphasized repeating Durga's name. And then we read about Swami Atmavidyananda's vision of Triveni. We also read a little bit from the Eternal Companion. And tonight we'll go back a little bit so that we'll get that section again from the Eternal Companion about how Durga Puja came to be celebrated by our order. And then there'll be some other selections from Swami Atmavidyananda with some extra material from the internet to explain some of the things that he's talking about. So, Atma, why don't you read where a little bit before we left off last time.
All right.
And this is, again, from the Eternal Companion, which is the life and teachings of Swami Brahmananda, the first president of the Ramakrishna order.
It was the year 1901, a few days before the annual worship of Durga God, the mother in her aspect as protectress of the universe.
Yeah, I think that's Durga / God.
Right.
Yeah, so it's actually okay.
Maharaj was sitting on the bank of the Ganges at Bellarmine, and suddenly he saw Mother Durga walking on the surface of the Ganges toward the monastery grounds. She passed under the sacred Vilva tree in the monastery garden and then disappeared. A moment later, Swamiji arrived by boat, came to Maharaj and said, "Raja, make arrangements at once for the worship of Mother Durga." Then he told Maharaj that he had a vision and had seen Mother Durga being worshipped at the monastery. Maharaj in turn described his own vision to Swamiji, and they began at once to prepare for the worship. Since that date, the special worship of Mother Durga has been held every year at the Bellarmine Monastery. Maharaj also performed the worship at the monasteries in Kankal, Benares, and Madras. He once told the Keelananda that he performed this worship in obedience to the mother's direct command. The Keelananda records that during the Durga festival in Madras, the power of Maharaj was specially felt by his disciples, and their minds were raised to higher levels of spirituality.
Yeah, and the previous head of this center, Swami Swahananda, was in Delhi for many years, and he was at sometimes the pujari for their Durga Puja down there. Now, there's an interesting thing, and we're going to skip the next couple of lines here because they're kind of disconnected from the body of the text, but the traditional time to worship Mother Durga originally had been in the spring. As we mentioned last time, mother goddesses traditionally were often goddesses that would be worshipped either at times of planting or at times of harvest or both. Well, originally, the main Durga Puja, in fact, there still is a Navaratri, a spring Navaratri, was a spring festival. And later it became also a fall festival. Now, how did that happen? Well, it has to do with a story that's related to the Ramayana, and yet we don't actually find that specific reference in the Valmiki Ramayana. You find references to it in other Puranas. So we're going to read a little bit about how that came about. So you can continue from where it says from the internet, just the Durga Puja.
Are we still in the Eternal Companion?
No, this is from the internet.
Oh, I see. Durga Puja is the celebration of the buffalo-headed demon Mahishasura's assassination at the hands of goddess Durga. Created by the gods Brahma, Vishnu, and Maheshwara, Shiva, and given the powers of 10 hands and special weapons, goddess Durga had battled Mahishasura for 9 days and finally killed him on the 10th day of Vijaya Dashami. However, the conventional time of Durga Puja is during the Basant Ritu, or the spring season. The custom of celebrating this festival in the autumn, or the Hemanta Ritu, was indeed initiated by Lord Rama in the Ramayana. Here's the story about this: Akal Bodhan, the untimely evocation of goddess Durga.
So now we're going to get several versions. So apparently different Puranic texts give different versions depending on the particular source. And there's one misprint here. It says slain instead of slay, but it's about 4 lines down. But see when we come to that. So let's read about Ravana, the king of Lanka here.
Ravana, the king of Lanka, had a special blessing of goddess Parvati, an avatar of Durga. But no enemy of his could defeat him in a battle with the goddess's permission. Because of this boon, Lord Ram was able to slay Ravana in the war to rescue his wife Sita. When Ram came to know of this boon from Ravana's brother, he decided to pray to the goddess and seek her blessing in winning the war. Hence, despite it being the season of autumn, Ram initiated the ritual of worshiping goddess Durga.
Yeah, so, and it's often described that way. In the beginning of the 9 days, it's said that Durga is coming down to help Brahma. I'm sure she probably could have come instantly, but somehow the story is better when it's 9 days. The 9 days often symbolize different aspects of the Durga, and there's, in one reference, they're kind of chronological. In other words, the starting in sort of like a childhood Durga and growing up and going through various stages of maturation and so forth. Now, there's a slightly different story, which I'll relate here. It says, someone is asking the question, so what did goddess Durga do about Ram's prayer? One of the key requirements in Durga Puja is the use of 108 blue lotuses, or Neel Kamal. Since blue lotuses were very rare and available only in the lake of Devidaha, Lord Rama sent Hanuman to fetch them. Hanuman was always running around fetching things for Rama. Hanuman, he was so fast, you see, he was as fast as the wind because he was the son of the wind. So that's why Hanuman was always the one to go fetch things. Hanuman returned with supposedly 108 of them, and the ritual of Durga Puja began. But as Ram neared the end of the rituals, he realized there were only 107 lotuses. Fearing his worship would go in vain without that last lotus, Ram decided to make a sacrifice instead. Known for his lotus-shaped eyes, Kamala Narayana, Ram felt his eye would replace the missing lotus in the ritual. As he brought an arrow close to his eye, goddess Durga appeared and stopped him. Delighted at Ram's devotion and humbleness, the goddess blessed him and promised to lift her protection from Ravana so that he could defeat him. So that is the story of Akal Bodhan, the untimely worship of goddess Durga in the season of autumn. I often wonder if this might have had something to do with a group of people migrating from climates where perhaps a planting season was in the spring down to the south. I should have looked this up, but I would imagine the south has several growing seasons because it's warm all the time. So you could probably have more than one. And so that might have something to do with how these stories get evolved, is that they're there to explain why things are changed. We're now going to worship the goddess in the fall because we're going to have another planting season. So I don't know. That's complete speculation on my part. But there are a couple of other versions of this, similar in some aspects, but slightly different. So you want to read the next one. It's also starting with somebody asking how this happened to come about. Question.
I've heard that Lord Rama worshipped Durga, Devi. Is this true? This story is based on the Ramayana. It does not actually come in the Ramayana text of Valmiki. It is found in various Puranas. When Rama was going to cross the ocean, some texts describe that he performed worship of Durga Devi to inform her of his intentions of invading Lanka. The reason for this is that Durga was the protector of Kavera's island of Lanka before it was taken by Ravana. As such, it was proper etiquette for Rama, acting as a human king, to inform Durga Devi that he was about to invade her area of control. In this story, Rama acts as a yajaman, and Brahma acts as a priest who performs the sacrifice to please Durga Devi.
Yeah, so a slightly different version. In this version, it's not Ravana that's gotten a boon, it's that the previous owner of the island was protected by Devi Durga. Now we're into the various collections of things from, in fact, I think that last section might have been from Atmavidyananda. He has this whole chapter, and he describes in elaborate detail the various sources of the Puranic texts about Durga and some of the other goddesses in Hinduism. And here he says, in the Sattvika Puranas, the story is described that Rama prays to Durga, and Durga replies, "I am your external shadow energy. Whatever you wish to do, I am your servant." This is along the lines of the text, Shrishti Stiti Pralaya Sadhana Shaktir Eka Chayeva Yasya Bhuvanani Bibharti Durga, which is found in the scriptures. Devi Durga, or Mahamaya, is then called the shadow energy of Lord Narayana. All right, so now there's another very short version of the same kind of story. Let's hear what that is.
In the Rajasika Puranas, the story is described differently. When Rama calls to Durga, she refuses to appear. Then Rama pierces his eye with an arrow, and Durga Devi appears crying tears of blood.
So different versions in different Puranas. Now he's going to go into this theory of the Yugas to explain perhaps why we end up with these different versions in different Vedas. So the idea is that we have the 4 Yugas, and in the Treta Yuga, a Rama figure is always the main figure and the savior of that particular period. And the theory goes that these yugas have been going around in cycles for ad infinitum. And so each time this happens, you have basically you have a different Ramayana story. Now that it seems a bit far-fetched to think that we can remember, or that people have been around long enough to have recorded stories about Rama in a different Treta Yuga. But that's the idea that he's presenting here. And who knows, maybe mystics tap into these kinds of things, that they can actually ferret this out. So do you want to read that little paragraph about the Puranas?
Throughout the Puranas, in various versions of the Ramayana, we find a variation of 3 types of puja Rama did, either to Shiva, Durga, or Brahma. It's likely that the variations are due to Yuga Bheda, or the minor differences that occur in different ages. The Rama Leela is performed every Treta Yuga, and as such it has occurred thousands of times with many variations. We do not know from which time period the stories are recorded in each book. Thus, there are many seemingly contradictory descriptions in the Puranas. It is described that Jambabhavan, the Vinara devotee of Lord Rama, takes part in each and every incarnation of Rama in the same body. The cosmic cycles of time are moving like seasons, and these histories are played out in every age on schedule.
Yeah, so that's an interesting idea that the Ramayana has actually taken place over and over again in these various yugas as the cycle goes through. Now he's going to talk about how Durga comes up in the Mahabharata, and he says he's quite a historian, you could say. Atmavidyananda did a lot of research and study. He says, but in different places of the Mahabharata, the name of Durga and hymns, eulogies are sung in her honor. There is, in the 6th chapter of the Virata Parva, a hymn composed by Arjuna in praise of Durga. In the Bhishma Parva, again, we find Sri Krishna advising Arjuna to make obeisance to Durga before the commencement of the battle and to pray for success. The Durga of the Mahabharata was a four-armed and four-faced virgin of dark complexion. Referred to as the slayer of the asuras, or demons, she was a goddess dwelling in the Vindhya mountains, delighting in wine, flesh, and animal sacrifices. It's very common in the earlier eras. In the Virata Parva, again, a hymn in praise of Durga describes her as a virgin of the family of Nandagopa, not yet the wife of Shiva. So you can see how complicated the mythology gets when you look at the details of all the Puranic texts. And of course, the Mahabharata is a Puranic text. Durga was then the goddess of the non-Aryan Sabaras, who put on the leaves of turmeric plants. Perhaps for that reason, Durga is given the name of Hamashabari, that she remained the goddess of the Sabaras and wore the leaves used by these people. Durga was also the family deity of the Gopas, or the Ahiras, or milkmen of the Vindhya mountains. And you want to read the next section on the epic Harivamsha?
That epic states, that is, Durga was worshipped by such aboriginal tribes as Sabaras, Parvaras, and Pulindas. Durga and Chandi were also the deities of the tribe called the Kiratas. Hence Chandi is named Karati or Karatini. In the Padma Purana, as well as in the Skanda Purana, it is described that at the request of Brahma, the goddess of night entered the womb of Menaka, the queen of Himalaya, and the complexion of Uma became dark in color. This proves clearly that it is the Vedic goddess of night who is being worshipped as the Parvati of the Puranas. Uma was born on the bright 4th day of the lunar fortnight of the month of Jyeshta. Hence the Vrata called Uma Chaturthi is observed on that day.
Yeah, so it gets very complicated, but as we mentioned in the last session, all of these goddesses are really just different manifestations of the one great Devi. And some of them had more prominence or a particular name in one tribal region as opposed to another. And then as communication developed around all of these different groups, or different groups migrated through various regions, pretty soon they got the idea that these are all just different names for the same goddess, and gradually the idea of a great Devi emerged, from which these are simply manifestations. And remember that the Puranic stories are meant to illustrate archetypal energies. They're not meant to be a soap opera describing events from day to day that they're supposed to hang together. You're not going to get the Puranas to hang together. They just don't. Because they're each representing a particular kind of energy or archetypal energy in the universe. And their stories are designed to be illustrative of those ideas and to get those ideas across. And they're not meant to be a continuous narrative. And as we say, they've come from all different regions and different tribes and so forth. And so they've all got their own ideas, and then they eventually kind of get merged together. But we find that this idea of the goddesses gets very, very complicated. So we have this Vedic goddess of the night. We mentioned also last time that the cycles of the seasons, the cycle of day and night, all these kinds of cycles tend to be associated with feminine deities. And so, again, we have that coming up here as the goddess of the night, then becoming the queen of the Himalayas, you see. And that's, again, the idea of Parvati and Shiva, but she wasn't necessarily the wife of Shiva yet at this point in the Vedic, in the Puranic text. All right, do you want to read a little bit about the Vedic goddess of night?
The Vedic goddess of night is sable-bodied. It is she who, in the name of Kali, is worshipped at night even today. Puranas describe why Durga has got another name, Katyayana. The great rishi Katyayana, by name, practiced severe penance on the Himalayas. One day to the hermitage came Brahma, Vishnu, and Maheshwara. There in a watchful mood, with the view to slaying Mahishasura, they drew forth from their beings energy which coalesced to form a goddess who is no other than Durga, the essence of all the deities. Since she was first worshipped by the great rishi Katyayana, she came to be called Katyayani, or the goddess adored and worshipped by Katyayana. This goddess Durga came into being on the 14th of the dark fortnight in Asvina. She was worshipped by Katyayana on the 7th, 8th, and 9th days of the bright fortnight in the same month. And on the 10th, she killed Mahishasura. Since Durga sprang from the energies of Brahma, Vishnu, and Maheshwara, she personified all their brilliance and power. Another name of Durga is Narayani, meaning thereby that she is Mahamaya Adyashakti, the great cosmic illusion, the source of the primordial energy in the form of a yogic trance, and hence a part of Narayana sleeping on the huge, many-headed snake. The Sashanga on the primeval waters, Karana Shalita, in the 7th chapter of the Ganesh Kanda, belonging to the Brahman Vaivarta Purana. Narayana himself says that the primordial energy persified, Goddess Durga created all worldly things. The very power of hers, which has created animals, has grown and sustained vegetables and plants. Hence her name has been Sakambari, the herb-bearing or the herb nourisher.
So we get roughly the same idea as the story told in the Chandi as to how the Devi was called upon to defeat Mahisasura, and that Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva combined their radiances and called upon all the other devas and gods to bring forth their radiance as well and give the Devi various powers and weapons, which had originally come from her. So they'd all gotten their powers from her. Then they were kind of doing their play, and then they got in trouble. So then they recreate, you could say, the Devi out of their powers. They recoalesce all of their powers back into the one Devi. I feel like some music. So let's see if we'll play a little section from a musical version that I wrote on the Chandi, and this is right after the gods have combined their radiant energy into the great Devi, and so then they are rejoicing about how the Devi has manifested. Oh, what happened to me? Did I leave this running? Okay, I guess I did. All right, we'll go back a little bit. What track is it? It's 8. Okay. All right, here we go. Ready?
Rejoice, 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 manifested
All right, so if you could hear those lyrics, you could hear how Varuna gave something and Shiva gave something. All the different gods and goddesses gave various ornaments and weapons. And then she was then getting ready to fight the battle against the Asuras. And first she has to fight the army of Mahisasura, all these great Asuras that cause so much trouble. They never fight the battles first themselves. They always send their armies out. Then once she defeats the entire army, then there's nobody left and they have to go out and finish the battle. So, all right, let's see. Well, why don't we do one more selection since it's kind of that time. So I'll play the selection right after his army is destroyed, and the Devi manifests in many forms. So she's going to manifest as the 7 Matricas, the 7 little mothers. And this is going to be track 11.
So most of the talk, it was a mix of you talking and a background music, which is, it's good. It didn't surpass your voice. Your voice was louder than it.
Oh.
So thank God.
Yeah.
Because it kept playing.
Yeah.
Elephants, chariots glitter the field, and yet Mahisasura still would not yield.
So I don't know if you noticed, but if you know Western music, you've noticed that the piece changed keys every time he changed form. So he changed from the buffalo form to the lion form to the man form, back to the buffalo form, the elephant form, and so forth. Each change of form was illustrated by a change in key. So she's now going to do him in. This is the most famous scene from the Chandi. And it's what's celebrated during these 9 days for the victory over Mahisasura taking place on the 10th. So this is, as I remember in the original Chandi, it's not actually put in her words. I had to sort of rework all the lyrics. Otherwise, it would have just been a narrator singing the entire thing, which would have been a kind of dull thing. So anyway, so I have her describe her battle against Mahisasura. and then he comes out and complains and so forth. But anyway, here we go. So just as she predicts, the Devas now all rejoice in that very spot where she had killed Mahisasura. So we got rid of Mahisasura. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about how she's also a very agricultural goddess. So let's see. Where are we? Shall we start with on the first day of Durga worship? It is.
On the first day of Durga worship, it is the custom to pay regard to an image of a goddess made of the leaves of 9 plants and supposed to represent Durga. The said image is called Navapatrica, commonly called Kalabao, or the goddess Durga in her 9 forms. This Navapatrica consists of varied types of fruits, roots, corns, and flowers. These are, that is, the plants, such as the plantain, the tuber, the turmeric, the nutmeg, the branches of bell tree, and ashoka tree, the aurum and the paddy plants, and a white of Pachara creepall. These, when bound together, give rise to the image of Navapatrica, which may be called the symbol of agricultural wealth. On the bright 5th waxing in Magha, goddess Sarasvati is invoked by every Hindu. This practice is in vogue for a long time, though exactly when it first started has not yet been ascertained.
Okay, now we're in a different section. So So anyway, it's interesting. It almost sounds like the original Rose Parade, doesn't it? Making a whole image out of different kinds of plants and flowers and leaves and spices and so forth. I doubt if they got the idea from this, but anyway, it shows that it goes back a long time. There's also that tradition with Ganesha as well, that you can make images of Ganesha out of fruits and flowers and vegetables and so forth. So it's interesting how many similarities Ganesha has with mother worship. They're actually quite similar. Now he's going to go into this very complicated historical evolution of the goddess Sarasvati, the goddess of learning and music and art and so forth. So we'll go ahead and continue a little bit with this. So she's going to tell us some of the early references to goddess Sarasvati, and who is often called her sister, goddess Lakshmi, and sometimes they're kind of mixed up. All right, so let's look and see what he's researched on that.
Goddess Sarasvati is invoked by every Hindu. This practice is in vogue for a long time, but exactly when it first started has not yet been ascertained. Some Puranas hold that it was Sri Krishna who introduced this ceremony and prescribed this day for beginning one's learning. Thus, the sacred bride fifth day is called Sri Panchami, or the day of Sri or Goddess Lakshmi. An inquiry as to why the day has been so called informs us that Lakshmi was married to Skanda on that date. Later in course of time, the day became fixed for Goddess Sarasvati instead of Goddess Lakshmi. Who this Goddess Sarasvati is and how old she is can be ascertained from the Vedas, which tell us that she's a Vedic deity. In the Rig Veda, female deities are quite few in number. Usha was the foremost among these Vedic female deities. Next to her was Goddess Sarasvati. The early meaning of the word Saras was brightness, so that Sarasvati applied abounding in brightness. This wondrously lustrous deity, corporeal and personifying learning and wisdom, had at first neither a female nor a male appearance. The Vedas give Sarasvati various names, such as Goddess Vak, Bharati, and call her Sarasvati, implying that she is the daughter and wife of Surya, the sun god.
See how complicated it gets. You know, it's interesting that Sarasvati doesn't have a Purana of her own. You know, there's a Ganesha Purana and a Shiva Purana and Puranas for all the different deities, but there's no Sarasvati Purana, and yet she's one of the more popular of the deities, which is very interesting that that has happened. And it's similar to what's happened in Catholicism. Saint Cecilia is, especially about 100 years ago, they went through a period where Saint Cecilia, everyone was absolutely, there's sort of a craze for Saint Cecilia, and she was the patron saint of music in the Catholic tradition. And yet they didn't really know much about her or where she'd come from or her history, and so they just made up stories. they just because they wanted a patron saint for music. And so the idea of music and learning and arts is so central to our culture that we have this innate need to have a feminine deity in charge of it. So, yeah, she's often called the Vak Devi. Vak just means speech. Kind of sounds like that, Vak and speech, voice. And so she is thought of as the Vak Devi, and of course the whole idea of sound and letters has to do with learning and music, which are also connected, because many of the, especially before written texts, the way people learned things was that they heard them in chanting or in tune form. And so they would learn things through musical words, basically. And so the fact that these are all connected into one goddess figure is very logical. And it continues on and says, again on the same ground, the Puranas describe her as the daughter of Brahma and give her the names of Gayatri and Satarupa. The Satya Purana says that she was the only daughter of the 10 children begotten of the mold of Brahma in the beginning of creation. So you see they've got all these different stories about who she's related to, which don't necessarily mesh. But she was so faultlessly beautiful that her exquisite charm and loveliness intoxicated Brahma, who grew heads on 4 sides and above, so as to gaze at her and repeatedly exclaim, "Ah, the beauty, ah, the beauty." So here's a myth that just explains why Brahma has the 4 faces that he does. We're going to skip a little bit down here. The carrier of Brahma was the swan, which is also then the carrier of Sarasvati. In the Markandeya Upanishad, which is the text that the Chandi comes from, she is the consort of Brahma, and she is described as being born by the swan. Regarding the origin of Sarasvati, the Brahma Vaivarta Purana, which is actually a Vaishnava text, says that she sprang from the mouth of Sri Krishna, who was Paramatman personified, and that at his command she became the spouse of Vishnu. But Vishnu had 2 other wives, Lakshmi and Ganga. The latter, moved by a fit of rage, cursed Saraswati that she would be turned into a river. Afterwards, at the behest of Vishnu, one part of the Saraswati became Brahma's wife, and the other part became the river Saraswati. In many suktas of the Rig Veda, there are hymns in honor of Saraswati and Saraswat. The word Saraswati stands for a river with abundant currents of water. White in color, this river is the giver of food, the goddess personified. It is stated in the Rig Veda. Do you want to read the next little paragraph?
This means, O white-complexioned goddess Sarasvati, it is through your divine grace that human beings get different kinds of food. So give us food protection and knowledge. In the Vedic era, Sarasvati was not simply a river carrying water. It was also the river of food and the bestower of wealth resulting from sacrificial rites. Regarding this, the Rig Veda says, Sarasvati is the producer of truthful statements and the preceptress of the intelligent people. In addition, the Vedas also say Sarasvati was the inspirer of all kinds of knowledge. Undoubtedly, therefore, she was the goddess of learning, even though she was a river. In the Vedic times, Sarasvati was a big river on whose banks were performed all the holiest sacrifices by the Aring Rishis. There, chanting the sacred verses of the Vedas, they would invoke and worship various deities. While the Aryans lived on the banks of this river, there occurred the gradual efflorescence of their religion, knowledge, ethics, and arts. It was through the grace of this river that their agriculture and commerce expanded, their social life got organized. In the Vedic age, therefore, Sarasvati, though a river, was regarded as the presiding goddess of all branches of knowledge, such as fine arts, mechanics, and the art of music and dancing.
All right. So, yeah, Sarasvati is a very, very important aspect, and she's sometimes referred to as the sattvic aspect of the goddess, and that's why she's all dressed in white and is radiant and so forth. And she's that's the revealing aspect. You see, sattva is the revealing guna, the guna that reveals the truth that's being hidden by Maya. Maya is made up of these 3 gunas, tamas, rajas, and sattva, and tamas veils the truth, raja projects this apparent reality, but sattva is the aspect that reveals the truth that's hidden behind the 3 gunas. And so the knowledge and music and arts and so forth is the most uplifting and the most enlightening thing that we find in the universe of ours. So I'm going to close with a chant, and then I'm going to leave you with another number from the oratorio on the Chandi, where the Devas are describing how she's being very gracious, and she even liberates her enemies, and then she promises to come to their aid whenever they sing hymns of praise to her. And they take her up on it. The next chapter in the Chandi is the famous hymn Ya Devi, where they again call upon her to defeat another group of asuras that have taken over. So we'll close with a chant, and then you can listen to the song at your leisure. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. Filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman all, yet is it still the same. Om, peace, peace, peace.